we are dedicating this Shiur tonight to the memory of Esther Pollard, Zichrona Libracha. Esther Yocheved Bat Yechiel Avraham Berezel Bracha. Esther was an exceptional person. I think most everybody in the Jewish world knows about her. She was completely and totally devoted to the cause of Jonathan Pollard, and she went literally to every corner of the globe in order to do whatever she could to help him. The truth is that, unfortunately, he served out the full extent and some of his sentence, but I believe, and I wrote a little something for tomorrow's paper about it, that in spite of the fact that he was not released early, which was really, of course, the goal because of the feeling of so many people that his sentence was cruel and unusual punishment and that he should have been freed long ago. I think pretty much almost everybody agrees upon that. Even the head of the CIA, the FBI, even his own prosecutor said that there was no reason to keep him in prison any longer. The fact is that he did serve out the full 30-year sentence and then some, because he had a 5-year parole. For some years, he couldn't leave New York and only came to Israel just a little bit over a year ago, as you know probably from following the story. But I think it was Esther's devotion to him that kept him alive. And the fact that he knew that ultimately he would be together with her, she really engaged in the ultimate Mesirat Nefesh. She really devoted her life to him. Unfortunately, because of the situation, they were not able to have children. In the United States, there are only 5 states actually in the United States where there is any form of having conjugal relations in prison, and not for any prisons that are maximum security where Jonathan was being kept. So unfortunately, they were unable to have children. So truly, Mesirat Nefesh, she was an amazing person. And I think, as I wrote in tomorrow's paper, she really lived up to the concept of Esther Hamalka, Queen Esther. She actually passed away on the eve of Rosh Chodesh Adar, which is the month associated with Purim. And for many reasons, she was, I think, really a heroic figure and had a certain sense of royalty about her. So very fitting the name Esther. So this is the Shiva week for her. And we hope this year will give her neshama and aliyah bashamayim. So let's start by quoting 2 great sources, the Beatles and the Moody Blues. So the Beatles said it in the end of one of their famous songs off, I believe, the Abbey Road album. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And the Moody Blues said something similar. One of my favorite groups, the Moody Blues, at the end of one of their songs. And when you stop and think about it, you won't believe it's true that all the love you've been giving has all been meant for you. And this is the theme of Parsha Truma that we're going to say a few words about. All of us are probably familiar with this famous phrase, Vayikhu li Truma. The pasuk says, and it's translated, let them take for me. It really means to give. Moshe Rabbeinu is collecting donations and contributions for the Mishkan, ultimately the Beit HaMikdash, of all these various things that people have to offer: gold, silver, those who are talented in terms of weaving, in terms of dyeing the cloths, etc., sculpturing, all of which went into this amazing construction of the Mishkan. But the pasuk doesn't say you shall give. Pasuk says vikhu, you shall take. So the famous comment I think all of us are familiar with, that there is this reciprocal arrangement between giving and taking, that when we think we are giving, in a sense, we are getting, we are receiving. There is this symbiotic relationship between what we give and what we get. And this is clear simply from the word natan, or if we want an even better palindrome, than simply to say the word of venitnu, and they will give, or they gave. Both of these are the same backwards and forwards. You can see it simply in the word natan, nun, tav, nun, sofit. So it's the same letters backwards and forwards, which is sending the message that whatever you're giving, you are getting in like measure or greater. The truth is, it's really greater. Hashem gives more in terms of, let's say, a reward than he would in a punishment. And we should mention too that it's important not only to give, but also to take, because if you don't have someone receiving what you want to give, then obviously your desire to give will be frustrated. So the people who say, I never take anything, I never accept any presents, I never accept, any gestures of friendship, that's to some extent cruel, because if you don't receive, nobody will be able to give. And the example, of course, of that is really Hashem, because he doesn't need anything. God is perfect. There's nothing that we can really give to God that makes God any better, etc., or that he desires on any level that we would think of. But Hashem wants us to give, to exercise that muscle of giving, and therefore he has to be the one who receives. So that's the concept, the idea behind this call that goes out to the people to donate to Torem, to give all of these various elements and all of these gifts to the Mishkan. And of course, the people give in great numbers. It's a wonderful thing. It's unheard of in Jewish history, where the fundraiser says, enough, that's it. No more donations, please. We're sold out. We've never heard that from any Jewish organization, I don't think, in history, that says, please don't donate anymore. But essentially, that's what happens with Moshe. He gets up and he says, enough. And we have everything we need. And thank you for donating, but the donation is closed and we can't take any more. We'll talk a little bit more about that idea and some people who are frustrated by it. But essentially, this Parsha is about giving, but also about receiving. And so therefore, we have this strange use of the verb vayikach, to take, which really means to give. Instead of God saying, please speak to the people and let them give, we use the word in a kind of almost backwards fashion, tikhu et trumati, take the donations, so that you have this circle going around of giving and taking and benefiting all the way. This is an ancient concept. Rav Dessler talks about the fact that the Hebrew word for love, or the root of the word for love, ahava, is hav, which means to give. If you want someone to love you, then give to them, and they will give you in return, and that creates this ongoing loving relationship. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but if you want to develop a love relationship, don't wait to receive, or you should receive when it comes to you, but also give. Both parties give, both will receive, and then you have a very positive relationship that's constantly one of giving. And that really is not only about love, it's about every mitzvah. The idea is that as you give to someone else, the reality is that you become the recipient. And that's a lesson that we have to know, and the essence of every single mitzvah. It's not for anybody else's benefit but your own, essentially. You think it may be for somebody else's benefit, but it's not. When you give tzedakah, it refines you as a person, and it develops in you a sense of compassion and empathy, and that helps you as much if not more, then it helps the person who's receiving the tzedakah. And the same is true of you and God. God gives you a commandment to keep Shabbat, but when you keep Shabbat, you are the beneficiary. And you think you are giving and you are structuring your week around Shabbat and you're keeping all the laws, restrictions, so to speak, all the rules of Shabbat. The truth is that at the end of the day, you are the one who had a great Shabbat. You did it, and you may have followed God's commandment and thought, okay, well, I'll do what God tells me to do in a sense that I'm giving to God. But of course, you are the real recipient. And that's true about every single mitzvah. Even sometimes it's difficult to sense and understand that, but ultimately, we are the beneficiary. There's many stories that illustrate. I want to tell 2 or 3 stories tonight about this same idea. One of the famous stories is a story told about a man named Rabbi Eliezer Gordon. He was the founder of the yeshiva of Telz, and he studied many, many years through the generous support of his father-in-law. He had a well-to-do father-in-law, and he was able to devote himself to study because of his father-in-law. But at some point he felt, enough already. I've studied, and yes, maybe I have more to study, but it didn't really feel right that he was being supported by somebody else, and he wanted to support himself, which of course is a very noble position. And he decided he wanted to take a rabbinic position, and he would utilize his learning. Maybe he wouldn't be able to study as much, but he would at least make a living. But his father-in-law pressed him and said, stay on a little bit longer. I'm not against you taking the position, but give it another year or 2. So he said, okay. That went on a couple of times. Finally, Rav Gordon felt, no, I have to support my family. I don't want to take any more from you. I want to take this position. And he actually became, this is a community in Europe called Aishashak. It's a strange name, but it's a very interesting community that became quite famous because when you go to Yad Vashem, you see in one of the halls, and if you've been to Yad Vashem, you know this very dramatic kind of dome that's filled with pictures of people from this city. That was the city. It actually was a city that Yafa Eliach was from. This was a project that she had. She passed away. She was a very fascinating person, Yafa Eliach, who wrote a tremendous book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, which is really a must for every Jewish library. But anyway, that's the city that he became the rabbi of. And he said to his father-in-law, I really can't allow you to support me any longer. And his father-in-law kind of said under his breath, I'm not sure who is actually supporting who. And on the very day that Rav Gordon moved to that city to take his position, his father-in-law had a heart attack and died. And in his first sermon to the congregation, he said, it was clear to me suddenly who was doing the giving and who was doing the receiving. Said, my father-in-law seemed to be the giver and I seemed to be the recipient, but in truth, perhaps his support and the tzedakah he was giving, he was actually the one who was receiving life as a result of it. And when that stopped, his life was over. So many stories similar to this. So perhaps you understand why in our Parsha, the Am Yisrael is first commanded to contribute to the Mishkan and only then commanded to build it. It's kind of strange, right? We have first goes out, the Parsha begins collecting all the different donations, and only later on their command comes, okay, now let's build a Mishkan. It seems more logical that Hashem should have said, okay, here's my plan for the Mishkan, and here's what we need, and now go out there and get the various objects and various items that we're going to put in it. But that's not what happens. What is the famous phrase that Hashem uses in this week's Parsha? When he says to Moshe, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Tell the people to make me a mikdash and then I will dwell in them. So the idea is that ultimately, again, you don't merit having a Mishkan, which is the repository of God's holiness, unless you first become giving people, right? First be the kind of people that God even wants to have a Mishkan. Show me that you're people that want to give of yourself and give selflessly your time, your money, your energy, and then you will become the architect of your own personal Mishkan. And then God will be delighted once he sees who the Mishkan is for. He'll absolutely be delighted to dwell both within it, and then, as we say in the famous comment, within you, v'shachanti b'tocham, not b'tocho, but God will dwell in you. In other words, God says, you're the kind of people that I want in my house, so to speak. This is a similar, you might have heard this also very famous, lovely story, and it's a good story for kids or grandkids to tell, the story about the king who wants a luxurious palace to be built. And he takes, let's say, the sum of $1 million. It's a pretty paltry sum today, but okay, let's call it $1 million. And he takes 3 architects and he says, okay, I'm giving each of you $1 million, and I want you to build me, your 3 great architects, build me a palace. And the first architect comes, he takes the $1 million and he says, you know, $1 million is a lot of money. I can cut corners and I can build a beautiful palace that at least looks good for a fraction of that, and I'll keep the rest of the money. Okay, the second architect comes along and he says, well, it's the king. I have to build something nice, but I don't necessarily have to spend all the money. I can build something that really looks great and is built well and solid, but I don't have to spend all the money. I can keep a significant amount for myself and everybody will be happy. It's a win-win. Comes the third architect and he says, listen, this is the king. He gave me $1 million. He expects me to do the very best job I can. I'm going to spend every penny of it. It's his money. And I'm going to build the most luxurious palace I possibly can. So they build their 3 palaces. The king comes to inspect. He looks them over. He sees and knows exactly what's going on. And he turns to them and he says, okay, very good, all of you. Now, guess what? I command each of you, take your family, go into the palace you built, and you live there for the rest of your life. That's the command. So what you build, they thought they were building for the king, but they really were building for themselves. And in a sense, this is what we do with our life. When we do something virtuous, when we do something generous, we're really building our own palace, even though we think maybe, we're giving to somebody else, but really we're the recipient. We have, again, this symbiosis of Natan Vilakach, giving and receiving all at the same moment. But there's another element that I want to talk about as well, and that's not exactly just about what we give, but it's also how you give. And that's maybe as or even more important. It's a difference between giving grudgingly or stubbornly or giving willingly, excitedly, with a certain desire, being proactive instead of being forced to give. And the Torah, I think, wants to tell us that, yes, it's important to give, but if you're going to really get the maximum effect and the most, as we say, what is it, for your bang to your buck, then you need to do it, to give in a certain way, with enthusiasm and with excitement. So we have also the story of the Nisi'im. Everybody was commanded to give. The Nisi'im were the elite, and they had, it's hard to imagine this, but even in the desert, there was a kind of, rich and poor division of the people. And the Nisi'im, they were a bit wealthier than everybody else. They were, again, more in the kind of royalty. And the Torah notes that sometimes, Nisi'im means princes, essentially. They were the leaders of the tribes, let's say. And the Torah notes that sometimes the word Nisi'im is spelled with 1 yud and sometimes with two yuds. Okay, and the rabbis comment on something that happened here, that the Nisi'im, when they heard the call to donate, they said, here's what we're going to do. Let all the people give whatever they're supposed to give, and let the common folk donate. And at the end of the donation drive, whatever is left undone, whatever is still needed, we'll fill that blank in and we'll give that. In fundraising, it's called deficit funding. And fundraisers love this, because if they're raising $10 million, somebody comes along and says, do the best you can with the general public, and whatever's lacking, we'll give. So the fundraiser knows I'm going to get everything I need. Even if I only get 3 million in the drive, this guy will give 7 million to make it up. So, it sounded like it was really a great plan and it's a win-win, but it wasn't, because what happened is, as we said before, the people gave everything. And then when it was time for the Nisi'im to do something, there was nothing left for them to give. And this was a bad situation. In fact, Hashem was angry with them and said to them, the problem, it sounds like what you were doing was a good plan, but it really wasn't. You know why? Because you didn't show any enthusiasm. You should have been the first, you should have been the leaders who came out there and led the way in giving and say, I want to give. This is a tremendous opportunity. I want to be on that list. You should have given first and let the people take that example. And so as a kind of fitting punishment, there's nothing left for you to give. And therefore, this yud is taken. Yud is always a letter that stands for God, right? It's the first letter in the name of God. So in a sense, God said, I'm taking myself out of there. And it was, a comment on their lack of enthusiasm and excitement. So God said, I don't want to be associated with that. Later on, when we read in Parshat Naso about the gifts of the Nisi'im at the dedication of the Mishkan, you see that the Yud has been put back because they learned their lesson. Now they came forward and they said, we want to be the first ones to give. And therefore, they now have two Yuds. There's always for those who know Yiddish, there's always a play on words here between Yud and Yid, because a Yid, right, means a Jew. So we say that something is missing when a Yid doesn't give with both Yuds. And the idea is that giving should be a privilege, not a punishment. And a person should actually feel happy and fulfilled after giving, not morose or sad. The afterglow of a mitzvah is usually a good way to gauge its importance to you. How do you feel after you did it? Giving should be looked upon not as oppressive, but as an opportunity. And the same is true for every mitzvah. And a way to kind of judge is, how did you feel when you kept that mitzvah? The afterglow, was it something that, made you very, very glad that you did it? I want to just conclude with one more famous story. You may have heard it, but it kind of sums up this whole idea of giving with enthusiasm and giving and that giving is receiving and receiving is giving. And it fits in very well with our Parsha of Truma, which talks about the building of the Aron Kodesh, right? The principal object item in the Mishkan and in the Beit HaMikdash was the Aron HaKodesh. That's where the 10 Commandments were kept, the Luchot, both sets, the first set that was broken and the second set as well. And that was the centerpiece of the Mishkan, right? And unfortunately, it was only in the first Beit HaMikdash. In the second Beit HaMikdash, it was missing. It had been hidden by the Kohanim, and for the first Beit HaMikdash, there were certain things that were not reproduced in the second, unfortunately. But at any rate, the Aron Kodesh became that symbol, and even today it's a symbol of our Mikdash Ma'at, right? Our miniature sanctuaries, which is our synagogues, our Beit Knesset. The centerpiece is always the Aron HaKodesh. It's what you basically, it's the direction in which you face. You don't necessarily have to face the Aron, but it's there in that direction on that wall, right? That eastern wall as you're facing, or the wall towards Yerushalayim. And in every Beit Knesset, generally, it's the most beautiful thing that which people are really directed towards. So the Aron Kodesh is a very famous and beautiful thing. So in the story, there was a man who was a baker during his life. He owned a bakery, and then he got old, he retired, and he felt, I want to do something productive, and I want to combine it somehow with giving for a religious cause or something for a spiritual reason. And he decided and had this idea that in the Beit Mikdash, there was the shulchan and the lechem hapanim, the table, and on it went the 12, what we call showbreads. That 12, it's a whole dispute whether these were chalot or matzot. Let's call them chalot for now, even though we're closer to being matzot, but fluffy matzot, like you have today, the Yemenite, the Teimani matzot, more like a lafa. Let's call it that, but we can think of it as a challah. So he, being a baker, said, I have this idea, and he said, I want to give a gift to God. And so he baked chalot, 12 chalot, every Erev Shabbat, and he didn't tell anybody about it. And he found a way to sneak into the Beit Knesset and brought his chalot, and he put it inside the Aron Kodesh. Well, the shamash comes to set up on Shabbat morning, and he smells this fantastic smell coming from the direction of the Aron Kodesh. What could that be? And of course, it smells like freshly baked something. He opens up the Aron and he sees there are these chalot. And he takes the chalot and he says, well, I mean, what should I do? He thinks, and he says, you know what? I will take the chalot and I will give them as a gift to 12 different poor families. And he gives the chalot away. He doesn't say anything to anyone. And later on, because he comes early to prepare, so later on, people come to shul, and one of them is the baker. He doesn't say anything, but he sees when the Aron is open for the Torah reading, his chalot are gone. And he says, wonderful, God must have taken my gift. And he was just so pleased with himself. It made his whole day. So he said, I'll do it again next week. If Hashem is accepting my gift of chalot, I'll do it again. And the same thing happens. He sneaks in, he puts the chalot in, etc. And once again, when the Aron is opened, they're not there. He's overjoyed. Well, after some weeks, he comes to put his, and the shamash doesn't really say anything about this, but he's also overwhelmed. He doesn't know who's putting the chalot there, but he thinks it's a wonderful thing. But one week, the baker comes, puts in the chalot, and there happens to be a man, a very wealthy man, who had come late for tefillah. And so he was still there after everybody had left. So he saw when the baker put the chalot into the Aron Kodesh. He doesn't say anything. He watches this. He sees the baker put in the chalot. He sees the baker leave. Later on, he comes the shamash, takes the chalot out of there and distributes them elsewhere. The man, who obviously wasn't very nice, he comes over to the shamash and he says to him, what are you doing there? He says, I don't know where these come from, but it's a beautiful thing. Somebody leaves them, and it may be an angel who puts them there. I give them out as tzedakah to poor families. And the man says, that's no angel who puts them in there. That's the baker. He puts it in there, and, maybe doesn't think that anybody will find out, but I saw what happened, and it's not coming from an angel, it's coming from him. And then later on, he sees the baker and he says, what do you think happens to your chalot? And the baker says, because I know you're putting them in there. And the baker says, I think God takes them and brings them to the heavenly Beit HaMikdash to use for his lechem apanim. And this fellow says to him, he laughs and he says, that's ridiculous. The Shamash is taking them and he's giving them out to people. God's not taking them. The baker is so embarrassed by this and upset that he stops the baking. The jig is up, the secret's out. He doesn't bake the bread anymore. Well, the next week, when there's no bread found in the Aron Kodesh, and the Shamash is very surprised by this and not happy about it either, he has a dream. And in his dream, God comes to him and says, since the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, nobody ever gave me as beautiful a gift as the 12 chalot of the baker that I indeed put on my shulchan in the Beit HaMikdash Shel Mala, and I want my chalot back. And as for the man who ruined the whole plan, you'll see what will happen to him. And the Shamash goes to the baker and he pleads with him and tells him, I had a dream in which God appeared to me and told me that he misses your chalot. Please, will you bring them back? And the baker is so excited to hear that his gifts are being accepted by Hashem that he goes and he continues to bake those bread. And as far as the rich man who tried to ruin the whole deal, according to the story, he lost everything and was spotted some years later in a distant town begging for a piece of bread. He was so poor. So this famous Hasidic story kind of brings out all the elements that we're talking about. The idea of giving, but in the end receiving. The baker gave, but of course he received. And it was this reciprocal kind of relationship. But he did it with this tremendous enthusiasm because he understood that when indeed God is taking my gift, so to speak, then God notices me and I am important, because when you give a gift to someone or something which is very important, you feel important. And that ultimately is the essence of this idea of truma, of giving, whether it's an object or whether it's your time, your energy, or your love, and doing it with a passion and a sense of purpose. So I think it's appropriate, this Parsha of Truma, to somebody, again, to Esther Pollard, who really made this tremendous Truma, this tremendous self-sacrifice to give of herself. As I said earlier, Jonathan became the object of this tremendous drive to do tzedek and to really see someone achieve freedom and ultimately new life. So although they only had a short time together after he was freed from prison, and only a little over a year to be together in Eretz Yisrael, ultimately I think they set a certain standard. And eventually, as Jonathan said at the funeral, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring them together. She loved the land. Now the land has embraced her, and he will live here and never leave here, he said. And he should live a long life, and her neshama should have an aliyah, and eventually they should be together, and Hashem will welcome them into his Beit HaMikdash Shel Mala. So thank you all for joining in. If anybody has a comment or something you'd like to say, you're certainly welcome to. Otherwise, thanks for sticking with the new time, 6:30, until we have to change again to fit it in with the time of Mincha and Maariv.
Stuart, can you tell us again that pasuk with the yud you were referring to?
Well, if you look up you'll see about the Nisi'im. You could do a Google on it if you want to. It'll tell you the different psukim where Nisi'im is right, normally spelled Nun Yud Sin, Aleph Yud Mem, and then sometimes it's spelled without one of those Yuds. Yeah, just write in Nisi'im probably in Hebrew in the Google, and it'll come up and it'll tell you the different psukim. It's a very famous Dvar Torah. But ultimately that comes along later on when the Nisi'im give their gifts at the dedication of the Mishkan. That comes in Parshat Naso. Okay, any other comments?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mishenichnas Adar, Marbim de Simcha. You have 60 days of Simcha. The Rebbe used to say that the great thing about one of the questions is, why is it 2 Adars? We could have had a much more creative name for the leap year when we add a month of Adar. Was all we could think of Adar Bet? Why can't we think of a name for it? So one of the comments of the Rebbe was that he said it's a good name because Adar is synonymous with Simcha. Mishanichnas Adar, Marbim b'Simcha. When Adar comes, you add to your Simcha. So now that you have 2 Adars, you get a double dose of Simcha. Instead of 30 days of happiness, you get 60 days. So it's good that kind of have an almost elongated Adar, not 30, but essentially 60 days. So everybody should have days of Simcha and stay healthy, stay well. See you next week.
Thank you too.